My beloved child, something changed in your soulmate's expression the moment one small detail stopped making sense. It was not dramatic at first. There was no loud confrontation, no sudden announcement, no scene that would make anyone nearby turn their head. It was quieter than that. Your soulmate was simply sitting with something the third party had told them, replaying the same explanation again and again, when a tiny contradiction appeared. A sentence that once sounded believable suddenly felt incomplete. A promise that had been accepted without question no longer matched what was actually happening. And in that ordinary moment, your soulmate began to wonder whether they had been misled far more deeply than they realized. Don't skip, because the surprising part is not simply what the third party did. It is what your soulmate noticed afterward, and why their thoughts immediately began drifting toward you. The third party had spent time creating an impression, shaping a story, carefully presenting themselves as someone who understood everything. They knew which words would make your soulmate relax. They knew how to make uncertainty sound like certainty. They knew how to take ordinary misunderstandings and quietly turn them into reasons for distance. But there was one thing they underestimated: eventually, a story has to match reality. And now, reality was beginning to speak for itself. Your soulmate remembered a conversation from days earlier. At the time, they had barely thought about it. Someone had mentioned something casually, almost in passing, and your soulmate had moved on. Yet now that forgotten sentence returned with completely different meaning. It contradicted what the third party had claimed. Not enough to prove everything, but enough to create a question. And sometimes one honest question can unravel an entire illusion. Your soulmate reached for their phone, opened an old conversation, and slowly scrolled upward. They were not searching for you at first. They were searching for clarity. But then they saw your name. Their hands stopped. For several seconds, they simply stared at it. Something important is waiting for you here, because this was the first moment the situation stopped being about the third party and became about what your soulmate had ignored inside themselves. They remembered the way you had once spoken to them without trying to control their decision. They remembered a moment when you could have pressured them, yet you gave them space instead. They remembered something simple you had said that made little sense back then but suddenly felt strangely relevant now: real care does not need confusion to survive. That memory stayed with them. And instead of opening your conversation immediately, your soulmate placed the phone down. Why? Because seeing your name brought another realization they were not prepared for. If the third party had been misleading them about one thing, what else had your soulmate accepted without checking? Stay till the end, because the next discovery did not arrive through some dramatic confession. It came through something much more believable: patterns. Your soulmate started thinking about how often the third party had spoken negatively whenever your name appeared. How quickly they had redirected conversations. How certain they always seemed about things they could not possibly know. Your soulmate remembered questions they had wanted to ask you directly but never did, because someone else had already supplied the answer. And that realization landed differently. They had allowed another person's interpretation to become louder than their own experience with you. For the first time, they could see how easily trust can be distorted when someone repeatedly inserts themselves between two people. The strange part was that your soulmate was not becoming angry. They were becoming quiet. Deeply quiet. Because beneath everything was a more personal question: what if I misunderstood someone who never had the chance to explain? That question followed them into the next hour. They tried distracting themselves. They walked into another room, picked something up, put it back down, checked their phone again, and then laughed softly at themselves because they knew exactly what they were avoiding. Your name was still there. The conversation was still unopened. The truth was still waiting somewhere between what they had been told and what they had actually experienced. Then something unexpected happened. A notification appeared, not from you, and not from the third party. It was connected to an old conversation your soulmate had almost forgotten. They opened it, read a few lines, and suddenly saw another inconsistency. A detail involving timing. The third party had claimed one thing happened first, but the message in front of your soulmate showed something else. Again, it was not some enormous revelation by itself. But now there were two contradictions. Two moments that did not fit. Two reasons to stop assuming. Your soulmate leaned back and closed their eyes for a moment. This was when their emotional reaction changed. They were no longer asking whether the third party had exaggerated. They were wondering why the third party had needed to exaggerate at all. And underneath that question was something even more uncomfortable: why had keeping you distant seemed so important to them? The answer was not clear yet. That is exactly why your soulmate resisted jumping to conclusions. Instead, they did something they should have done much earlier. They began separating facts from opinions. What had they personally seen? What had they personally heard? What came directly from you? And what had always arrived through someone else? Slowly, the picture changed. The third party's influence had been strongest wherever direct communication between you and your soulmate had been weakest. That realization felt almost embarrassingly simple once your soulmate saw it. Confusion had grown in empty spaces. Assumptions had filled conversations that never happened. And the third party had benefited every time your soulmate chose silence instead of clarity. Then your soulmate finally picked up the phone again. Because they wanted to understand one final thing first. Something about the third party's story had never been about protecting your soulmate. It had been about influencing what your soulmate believed about you. And now your soulmate had quietly decided that nobody else would answer for you again. The next question would go directly to the source. What your soulmate does not yet know is that the missing detail they are about to uncover may completely change the meaning of everything that happened before, and when that truth finally comes into view, the person who thought they controlled the story may discover that the story no longer belongs to them. The message was never sent that night, but something even more revealing happened because of the hesitation. Your soulmate sat with the unfinished words still glowing on the screen, and instead of rushing toward an answer, they began remembering details they had pushed aside for far too long. Small moments. Strange pauses. Conversations where the third party seemed to know exactly what your soulmate was thinking before they had even explained themselves. At first, those moments had felt like understanding. Now they felt different. Your soulmate suddenly realized how often their uncertainty had been used as an opportunity for someone else to shape the conclusion. And once they noticed that pattern, they could not stop seeing it. Don't skip, because the truth did not arrive all at once. It began appearing through ordinary memories that had been sitting quietly in the background, waiting for your soulmate to finally look at them without someone else's interpretation attached. One memory stood out immediately. There had been a day when your soulmate had almost reached out to you. They had opened your conversation, typed something simple, then mentioned it casually to the third party. The response had come quickly, "Maybe you should leave it alone." At the time, your soulmate thought it was reasonable advice. But now another question appeared. Why had the third party been so invested in stopping a conversation that had not even happened yet? Your soulmate stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment. The third party had not asked what your soulmate wanted to say. They had not asked how your soulmate felt. They had simply discouraged the connection. And suddenly, your soulmate remembered that it had happened more than once. Every time the possibility of clarity appeared, another reason for delay seemed to follow. Wait a little longer. Don't complicate things. Maybe you misunderstood. Perhaps they have moved on. None of those statements had been based on anything you had actually said. They were guesses presented with confidence. And your soulmate had treated them like facts. That realization hurt in a quiet way, not because your soulmate wanted someone to blame, but because they could finally see how much time had been lost inside assumptions. They picked up the phone again. Your conversation was still open. This time, instead of scrolling through messages, your soulmate looked at the dates. That was when another detail emerged. A period they remembered as distant and disconnected did not look that way anymore. You had reached out during that time. Not dramatically. Not repeatedly. Just enough to show that the door had never been completely closed. Your soulmate remembered being told that your silence meant you did not care. Yet here was evidence of the opposite sitting directly in front of them. A simple message. A thoughtful sentence. A moment they had overlooked because someone else had already told them what it meant. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate began understanding that the so-called scam was not necessarily some grand scheme or dramatic betrayal. It was something subtler and more realistic. They had been influenced into trusting a version of events that benefited someone else more than it benefited the truth. And now that version was beginning to fall apart under its own contradictions. Your soulmate became unusually calm. That calm surprised even them. They expected frustration. Instead, they felt clarity growing. When confusion starts disappearing, people often stop reacting and start observing. That was exactly what happened. Your soulmate decided not to confront anyone immediately. They wanted to listen differently first. The next time the third party brought you up, your soulmate paid attention to the wording. It happened sooner than expected. Your name appeared almost casually in conversation. The third party made another confident statement about what you supposedly wanted, what you supposedly felt, what you supposedly planned to do next. Normally, your soulmate might have accepted it or changed the subject. This time, they asked one quiet question: "How do you know that?" The room seemed to shift. Not dramatically. Just enough. There was a pause that lasted slightly too long. Then came an explanation that sounded smooth on the surface but did not actually answer the question. Your soulmate noticed. For the first time, they noticed everything: the change in tone, the vague wording, the way the conversation immediately moved somewhere else. "Stay till the end," because that tiny pause became more meaningful than any dramatic confession could have been. Your soulmate did not need to accuse anyone. They simply realized the certainty they had trusted was not built on certainty at all. Later, when they were alone, they returned to the unfinished message they had written to you. "Can I ask you something?" It suddenly felt too small. There was so much more behind it now. Your soulmate deleted the sentence again, but this time they replaced it with something different. "I think there are things I should have asked you directly." Their finger hovered over send. The moment stretched. Not because they doubted the desire to speak with you, but because sending those words would mean admitting something to themselves. They had allowed too many voices into a space that should have belonged to two people. They had listened to interpretations instead of conversations. And if they were going to change that, they would have to become vulnerable enough to hear your side without defending the story they had already believed. That took courage. Your soulmate placed the phone beside them and walked toward the window. Outside, everything looked completely ordinary. Cars moving. Lights appearing. People continuing their routines. Yet internally, something important had shifted. They no longer wanted someone else to tell them who you were. They wanted to remember who you had actually been when nobody else was speaking for you. And those memories came back with surprising tenderness. The way you noticed little things. The way you sometimes understood their silence without demanding an explanation. The way your soulmate had once felt unusually comfortable around you before uncertainty entered the picture. None of those memories proved what would happen next. But they reminded your soulmate of something they had forgotten. Their own experience deserved a voice too. Then another memory surfaced, one that changed the direction of everything. Months earlier, the third party had mentioned a specific conversation they claimed to have had with someone connected to you. That conversation had shaped one of your soulmate's biggest assumptions. They had never questioned it because the details sounded believable. Now, with trust already beginning to crack, your soulmate decided to verify it. Not through gossip. Not through another opinion. Through the person who had supposedly been involved. The response came later than expected. Your soulmate almost forgot they had asked. Then the phone lit up. They opened the message slowly. The answer was short. Surprisingly short. And it contradicted the story your soulmate had heard. Not completely, but enough. The conversation had happened, but several important details had been changed. Words had been taken out of context. An ordinary comment had been turned into something much more significant. Your soulmate read the response again. Then once more. This time, there was no confusion about what they were feeling. Disappointment, yes. But beneath it was relief. Because the mystery was finally becoming understandable. They were not imagining the inconsistencies. Pieces really had been rearranged. And suddenly, your soulmate understood why the third party had always preferred indirect communication. Direct questions made the story harder to maintain. Your soulmate looked back at your conversation. The message they had drafted was still there. "I think there are things I should have asked you directly." This time, they did not delete it. They added another sentence, "I'm starting to realize I may not have heard the whole story." Their heartbeat changed slightly as they read it. There was humility in those words. There was also possibility. The possibility of clearing something that had remained clouded for too long. But just before they pressed send, another notification arrived. It came from the same person who had helped verify the earlier conversation. There was one more detail they had forgotten to mention. A detail involving the third party, your name, and a conversation your soulmate never knew had happened. Your soulmate opened it. Their expression changed instantly. Because this was no longer about someone simply giving bad advice or misunderstanding a situation. It suggested the third party had known something important about you for a long time and had chosen not to tell your soulmate. For several seconds, your soulmate did nothing. Then they whispered a question they had never expected to ask: why would they hide this from me? The answer was not written in the message. But the clue was finally there. And what your soulmate discovers when they trace that hidden conversation back to its beginning may explain why the third party worked so hard to keep you misunderstood in the first place. Nothing could have prepared your soulmate for how ordinary the hidden conversation looked at first. There were no dramatic words, no obvious confession, no single sentence that explained everything. Just a few exchanges, a handful of details, and one quiet omission that suddenly made the entire situation feel different. Your soulmate read through it slowly, almost expecting the meaning to disappear if they looked too closely. But it did not. The third party had known that you were not trying to interfere, compete, or create confusion. They had known you had actually stepped back because you respected your soulmate's space. And somehow, that simple truth had never been passed along. Instead, your silence had been interpreted for you. Your distance had been given a meaning you never chose. Your soulmate felt something soften and tighten at the same time. Don't skip, because this was the moment they finally understood what had really been taken from them. It was not just information. It was the chance to make their own decision with the full picture in front of them. They began replaying old moments with new eyes. Every time they had wondered why you seemed quiet, every time they assumed you had stopped caring, every time they allowed the third party's explanation to fill in the blanks, there had been another possibility sitting underneath it all. Perhaps you had simply been trying not to push. That realization stayed with your soulmate longer than anything else. They were not interested in creating a confrontation. They did not want revenge, drama, or another cycle of assumptions. What they wanted now was something much simpler and much stronger clarity. So they finally returned to the message waiting on their screen. I think there are things I should have asked you directly. I'm starting to realize I may not have heard the whole story. They read those words one last time. Then they added one more line: if you're willing, I'd like to understand. And this time, they pressed send. The message left the screen so quietly that for a second your soulmate almost could not believe they had done it. No fireworks. No instant transformation. Just one honest action replacing months of uncertainty. Then came the waiting. Your soulmate placed the phone down, picked it up again, tried to distract themselves, and finally laughed at how impossible it was not to wonder what you might say. But something had already changed regardless of your response. They had stopped allowing someone else to speak on your behalf. Stay till the end, because the most important truth was not hidden in what the third party had done. It was hidden in what your soulmate had finally learned about themselves. They realized how easily fear of awkwardness can make people avoid the conversations that matter most. They realized that trusting someone does not mean surrendering your own judgment. And they realized that a connection can become distorted when two people stop speaking directly and everyone else begins filling the silence. Minutes passed. Then the phone lit up. Your soulmate froze for just a moment before looking. It was your response. Short. Calm. Nothing exaggerated. You had not attacked anyone. You had not tried to make yourself look perfect. You simply said you were willing to talk, and that there were things you had wanted to explain for a long time but never felt sure you should. That sentence landed more deeply than you might imagine. Because it confirmed something your soulmate had only recently begun to suspect: there had been another side to the story all along. Your soulmate sat down and exhaled slowly. For the first time in a long while, they did not feel pulled between competing voices. They felt present. Ready to listen. Ready to ask questions without deciding the answers in advance. Something important is waiting for you here, because when the conversation finally began, the biggest surprise was not a shocking secret. It was how many misunderstandings disappeared almost immediately once the two of you were speaking without anyone standing in the middle. A sentence your soulmate had believed meant rejection had actually been hesitation. A moment they had interpreted as indifference had been your attempt to respect boundaries. A story they had been told about your intentions had left out the one detail that changed its entire meaning. With each clarification, your soulmate became quieter. Not because they were upset, but because they were realizing how different things might have been if this conversation had happened sooner. Yet you did not stay trapped in regret. Neither did they. The conversation gradually moved away from what had gone wrong and toward what could be done differently now. More direct questions. Less assumption. More honesty. Fewer outside interpretations. No promises about what the future had to become, only an agreement that if something mattered, it deserved to be spoken about clearly. That was enough. And somewhere inside that calm exchange, your soulmate finally understood the third party's greatest mistake. They had assumed that controlling the story would always control the connection. But once two people begin communicating honestly, borrowed narratives lose their power. Your soulmate no longer needed someone else to explain you. They could simply ask you. They no longer needed to guess how you felt. They could listen. And they no longer needed to choose between dramatic versions of the past. They could look at what actually happened and decide for themselves. The so-called scam had worked only while confusion remained unquestioned. Now the questions had begun, and the answers were bringing something unexpected: not chaos, but peace. Your soulmate looked at your final message that evening and smiled in a way they had not expected to. There was still much to understand. Trust would not rebuild in a single conversation. The future remained open, and that was perfectly okay. But one thing was different now: the connection was finally being given the chance to exist without someone else constantly defining it. And as your soulmate set the phone down, one final realization stayed with them. The shocking truth was never simply that someone had misled them. It was that they had almost walked away from something meaningful without ever hearing your side. Now they had heard enough to know the story was not over. In fact, for the first time, it might finally be beginning on honest ground.